Yes, 3801 is worth singing about. I remember as a young fellow being taken over to the railway station by my father, a railwayman all his life, to see the first 38 class loco to steam into our part of the country. There were other railwaymen and their families on the platform to welcome the 38, because in the 1940s, we railway families tended to regard the railway as really belonging to us. It was a very special relationship. We were all proud of the streamlined 38s. They were a triumph in Australian loco design and construction. Thousands of steam trains were built in Australia during the golden age of steam, but few captured the imagination of people everywhere like the 38 class. The class leader, 3801, went on to become a legend in steam. From the archives of the ABC and steam buff Jim Powell, we've compiled this tribute to 3801. It's also a tribute to the men and women of the railways and the preservationists who've worked so hard over the years to keep 3801 on the rails. So sit back and enjoy the story of one of the world's great steam locomotives, 3801. The first of the C-38 Pacific class type locomotives took shape on the floor of the Clyde Engineering Works in Sydney in the early 1940s. They had a 462 wheel design with 6 coupled driving wheels. The boiler system was capable of producing the highest boiler pressure in Australia, 245 pounds per square inch. All this added up to one of the most powerful passenger locomotives in the country. And that was big thinking back in 1938 when the plans were being prepared. The first 5 of the class were built at Clyde, and all these were streamlined. The other 25, without streamlining, were built in the workshops of the New South Wales Government Railways, 13 at Everleigh in Sydney and 12 at Cardiff in Newcastle. The design of the 38s represented a big leap forward in the shape of Australian locomotives. The head of the design team, Chief Mechanical Engineer Harold Young, was probably influenced by American design trends of the time, but insisted that the 38 was an Australian locomotive in its essentials. Building these and similar large locomotives was a task that had a lifelong impact on many of the men in the workshops. Their pride in the great steam engines endured long after their retirement and the demise of steam. They didn't know it at the time, but the design and construction of the C-38 was to be the most outstanding and the last significant project in Australian steam locomotive construction. .3801 went into service in January 1943. By 1945, the 5 streamlined 38s from Clyde were in service and building a reputation that was to put them among the great locomotives of the world. .3801 with a Newcastle Flyer. Nowhere were the 38s more concentrated than between Sydney and Newcastle, Australia's busiest rail route. They ran the Brisbane Limited, Brisbane Express, the Daylights, the Night Mails and the famous Newcastle Expresses, better known as the Flyers. Sydney Terminal Station, June the 28th, 1964. The Sydney Tramway Museum had arranged a special event for Class Leader 3801, an attempt on the 1938 Sydney to Newcastle rail speed record of 2 hours, 10 minutes. Engine 3801, load 240 tonnes and 476 enthusiasts. The timetable, 2 hours, 9 minutes, time to the half minute. O1's first special event was on April the 15th, 1962. It worked the last Melbourne Limited from Junee to Albury. To railwaymen, a fast train is a platform sweeper. Swept clean were Woy Woy, Ourimbah, Tuggerah, Wyong, Waihi, Burragul. 70 miles an hour for long stretches. A top speed of 80 miles an hour was reached. The New South Wales Special Train Notice ruled, under no circumstances are the special trains to be stopped out of course. Wasted whistles, a signals check near Newcastle. Passengers and crew angrily watched the seconds tick by. However, for engine and crew, a triumph. 2 hours, 1.5 minutes, a record, and it still stands in 1988. Time was lost on the return by confusion in Sydney Yard, and an assured new record of under 2 hours was denied. Casualties, driver Sid Kemp and the pigeon which crashed through his window. Steam's time was running out. Even 38s were to be found on the scrap roads. 3801 had been set aside in 1962, reprieved and overhauled in 1963, and set aside for static preservation in October 1965. This is Cardiff Railway Workshops, where 12 of the non-streamlined 38s were built. Following an offer of financial assistance from the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum, the Railway Department agreed to a heavy overhaul for 3801 instead of another 38 class loco. 01 was transferred to Cardiff. It was outshot on October the 20th, 1966. Extensive running in followed on goods trains between Broadmeadow and Gosford. Then on Sunday, November the 6th, like the mythical Phoenix, 3801 was alive and ready to return to Sydney, with sister engine 3830 and a trainload of museum members. 01 then entered regular service and became the engine for special events. May the 31st, 1969 was within days of the 25th anniversary of the first 38 working the Newcastle Flyer. The Rail Transport Museum approached the department to allow 3801 to work the regular down morning flyer and the up midday flyer from Newcastle. Electric locomotives had hauled the flyers as far as Gosford for 9 years, and all steam was soon to go. So it was an indication of the department's high regard for 3801 that it agreed. 3801 had no trouble keeping to the normal tight timetable with an increased load. The first passenger train to be hauled by a 38 was the Southern Highlands Express from Goulburn to Sydney on February the 23rd, 1943. The 38 was 3801. Here, 26 years later, on Saturday, October the 11th, 1969, 01 draws the same train, the ceremonial last scheduled steam train to Sydney. The train had been diesel hauled for years, but some thoughtful railway official had 3801 rostered for the occasion. The genuine final steam train to Sydney was number 50 passenger from Moss Vale, which earlier had arrived almost unnoticed behind loco 3813. As usual, 3801 stole the show. Yet planning was well advanced for 3801's epic journey across the nation in 1970, followed by a steaming to Maree, South Australia in 1972. Australia's most famous and most travelled locomotive had one more very special journey to make, and that was during Easter in 1973. .3801 and 3820 rolled a capacity load to Melbourne, Victoria. The standard gauge went through in '62, and only then was it possible to travel between Australia's two biggest cities without changing trains. Albury, the old break of gauge station. Here, almost on the border with Victoria, the Victorian Railway's 5'3" gauge and the New South Wales standard gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches met. Well, almost. All freight and all passengers had to be transshipped, as they were at Broken Hill, Port Pirie, Kalgoorlie, and still are at Brisbane. In 1937, the Victorian Railways launched Australia's first glamour train, the Spirit of Progress. Sweepingly streamlined, from the famous S-Class Pacific steam locomotive to the round tail of the parlour observation car, the train ran non-stop between Melbourne and Albury, its passengers in air-conditioned comfort and refreshed by meals from the dining car. Close to midnight, passengers would step out to the cold or heat at Albury. Drawn up, one behind the other, at Australia's second longest platform, were the New South Wales Melbourne Limited Express and the Melbourne Express. In winter, foot warmers for the second-class passengers on the Express and hard sleeping berths for those who could afford the first-class fare, plus supplement on the Limited. All that had ended 11 years before the first steam train was able to make the entire run between the two capitals. It took that long for the Rail Transport Museum to conclude negotiations with the Victorian Railways and the unions to obtain approval for steam to go through. Glenrowan, a typical Victorian country station and heart of Ned Kelly country. The standard gauge bypasses all broad gauge stations. Victorian enthusiasts came up the northeast broad gauge line to meet the foreign special and steam back to Melbourne behind Hudson R707, running parallel with the New South Wales train. It was early evening at Melbourne's Spencer Street Terminal, end of the journey for Sydney trains. The Sydney Express, Sydney Limited, Spirit of Progress, the Intercapital Daylight, the Southern Aurora. So those that understood were there, to marvel at the mystic magic of the steam locomotive, personified by R707, 3820 and engine number 3801.
Only 3 years ago, 3801 showed the scars of more than 40 years of faithful service in the SRA. But under the guiding hands of a joint restoration project involving nearly 400 apprentices, the loco is once again the pride of the fleet. She was recommissioned in Newcastle today, capturing an era of steam. To make sure things were kept rolling smoothly, 97-year-old George Webber, a former driver in the time of steam, was there to lend a hand. But who better to shovel the first load of coal than the man who headed the restoration task?
If it were possible for me to say what would I like to commemorate my departure with, it certainly would be 3801, the best locomotive in Australia, coming out again.
3801 is the first of a class built to eliminate double heading and haul huge loads economically at speeds of up to 130 kilometres an hour. But for Novocastrians, she's remembered as the loco that headed the Newcastle Flyer to Sydney. And it was all steam ahead in 1966 when she recorded the fastest speed between the two cities, clocking in at 2 hours and 1.5 minutes. For all those who've worked on the loco, it's been a mammoth task. Each of the 250,000 parts were restored one by one. But now the job has finished and the old loco will soon roll out of town. Next week, 3801 will return to Sydney, where she'll officially take up her new position as the SRA's flagship. But her most important journey will take place throughout 1988, where she'll be a popular feature in the bicentennial celebrations.
November the 29th, 1986, and 3801 stands ready at Newcastle Station for its official return to service after restoration and rebuilding. Several hundred rail fans had travelled from Sydney by steam train to take part in the triumphant return of 3801 to Sydney. For the enthusiasts, the sight and sound of 3801 steaming again was something well worthwhile recording. This was the end of 10 years of enforced retirement, due mainly to boiler defects. It had taken the State Dockyard Workshops 3 years to restore 3801, and now it was ready again to take its place as the premier working steam locomotive in New South Wales. The restored 3801 is now operated by a new company called 3801 Limited. The company was formed by the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum, the New South Wales Division of the Australian Railway Historical Society, and the State Rail Authority. The company led the drive for funds to help restore the locomotive and will be instrumental in helping 3801 pay its way, thus securing its future as a working locomotive. The grand combination of steam and steel thundering down the main line made heads turn in suburbs and the bush. .3801 was opening a new chapter in a glorious history that already was the most famous locomotive adventure in Australia. As a combination of aesthetics and practical engineering, 3801 is in a class of its own, a machine of rare grace and beauty, and a tribute to the men and women of Australia's steam era. It was inevitable in a way that eventually 3801 would be eulogised in song. The loco had so much fame and folklore that someday someone had to be inspired to sing about it. On the 1st of July 1987, the song 3801 was launched. To mark the occasion, the grand old loco hauled a load of special guests from Sydney Terminal to the State Rail workshops at Chullora, where the song was born. The song emerged as part of an Art in Working Life project, sponsored by the Australia Council and unions. It was written by Chullora workmates Ray King and Ron Russell. They'd known each other since the early 1960s, when they were apprentices at Everleigh workshops. So, for 3801, this was another special day. And on board for the occasion was one of the loco's oldest friends, veteran driver Jack Sparks.
I saw this locomotive when it came out of the workshops at Clyde Engineering at Clyde in 1943. And that was the same year that I was appointed a loco fireman in the same month. Although I was in Grafton when I came back to Sydney in 1945, I worked with the engine right up till its last working money-making trip for the Public Transport Commission, and I was then on it as what we know as a senior locomotive travelling inspector on its last trip on the 10th of October 1969. I used to be a fireman and I used to be a driver, and then I used to do many trips with it when it used to go out on historical trains, excursions, all types of trains. And I was even with it part of the time when it went to Perth in 1970. And it's a beautiful locomotive, it's a beautiful machine. There's no doubt about it. And I mean, it's 44 years old this year. So I've been with it all through its working career, the same as it's been with myself.
Better than the modern stuff?
Well, it all depends what you like. Some people like vintage cars and some like modern cars. Now, I like old steam engines, and although you have to give way to modern technology, there's no argument about that. You see, to work that locomotive round about the 1956 era, 1955, when the electric engine started to come out, it would cost to run that locomotive a tonne-mile. That means for each tonne behind the train, for each mile that it ran, it would cost something like $1 or $1.20 to run it. But when the electric engines came out, it went down to about 45-50 cents a tonne-mile. So you can see, you can't go back, you can only go forward.
Happy to see it back though for the time being?
Oh yes, it's nice to see that it's still with us and being restored. If I can tell you, in 1949, when I was appointed a driver, I was only 2 months old as a driver. And I was on a little train, a little shunting train, and the Melbourne Limited Express used to be worked by Goulburn enginemen. And this particular night, the Goulburn driver took ill, and I was taken off my train and I was sent to the depot to get the locomotive ready to put it on the train of number 3 South, the Melbourne Limited Express. And I was to be relieved by a salaried driver, which was the thing. I expected this. But he didn't turn up. So I went to Goulburn. Now, to be on that locomotive to sit down there on the Melbourne Limited Express, which was the top train in those days. It was the top, it was the in thing in those days that you travel by train. You didn't have the great jumbos flying all over the place and great big super coaches and big cars and good roads to travel on. You done it by train, and it was an all-sleeper train. To open up that throttle of that locomotive on that particular night was the ultimate in my career on the railways.
That was this train?
That was that locomotive. So we came in together, we went out together, and I worked on it all the years that it was with us. So that's my association with 3801. And one thing you can't take away from anybody is memories. And I've got stacks of them.
Several hundred railway workers turned out for the lunchtime concert to launch the song. Ray King and Ron Russell and their group Chullora Junction were given a big reception by the workers, many of whom had participated in the Art in Working Life project.
What do you say to critics of programs like this? You say it's all a load of rubbish and it's a waste of money.
Well, that's the damn thing. Well, all I can say is that I think that's a rather elitist view of art, because it's not the preserve of the opera lovers or the ballet lovers. It belongs to everybody, and workers have and working people in general have a valid cultural expression.
I mean, we're not put on this earth just to fix trains and nothing else. We have other things. We have hobbies and all sorts of things, and music is just one part that we've been involved with.
I think it gets away from the idea that people are just factory fodder, and your only thing you got to do in life is come to work, produce something, and go home, watch television, go to the football on Saturday, and that's all you got to do in life. There's more to life than that, and we're hoping to encourage other people to see that the same way.
Working days and working nights.
Perhaps the most historic journey made by 3801 was the crossing of the continent in 1970. The first loco to run all the way from the east coast of Australia to the west coast. We have the story of that unique journey, which marked the 200th anniversary of the discovery of the east coast of Australia by Captain James Cook. Cook's ship was called the Endeavour, and the train hauled by 3801 was called the Western Endeavour. It was one of the really great train journeys in the history of steam.
The trip of the Western Endeavour was to be the journey of a lifetime. By steam train across the Australian continent. A round trip of almost 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometres. One of the greatest steam train journeys in history and the culmination of 6 years of planning by the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum. The city of Sydney on the east coast was the departure point for the epic journey, which began on Saturday, August the 22nd, 1970. Sydney-siders watched with fascination as the first train to steam from the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean set out. The Blue Mountains of the Great Dividing Range, with grades as steep as 1 in 33, was the first challenge for the two 38-class locomotives hauling the Western Endeavour. Australia is the world's flattest continent. The greater challenges were of distance and logistics. For one of the passengers, Harold Young, this was a proud moment. As Chief Mechanical Engineer of the New South Wales Railways in the 1940s, Harold Young was in charge of the design of the 38 class.
It's great satisfaction to see the locomotive that you had in your mind working. It's you, really. And any carelessness or any mismanagement hurts. It does, you know. I've always had an ambition as a designing engineer that I'd like to have the freedom to provide a locomotive entirely new from the rail to the chimney. It's a living thing, and it always amazed me that it could go on its own. It would run. I'm a great admirer of the racehorse, and I thought if I could put 2,000 racehorses together, horsepower, it would make a very good locomotive. There it is.
Once over the mountains, the train was steaming into the vast expanse of the Australian outback. The coast-to-coast passengers settled down to savour with exclusive pleasure the special joys of 3 weeks of steam travel. In the loco cabs, the hard work of keeping up steam pressure had its own special pleasure for the crews. This was no ordinary job. This was history in the making, a step back in time to the great days when steam was king. Locomotive 3801, arguably the most famous locomotive in Australia, was to travel to Perth in Western Australia. 3813 would assist in the haul at times as far as Port Augusta in South Australia. Menindee, the Darling River crossing. Never before had a 38 been seen this far west. For the people of the outback settlement, the spectacle was a great attraction. The journey so far had tarnished the engines, so some of the paying passengers went to work cleaning them up. Many of the local children were seeing a steam locomotive for the first time, and it was a memorable experience. Ensuring adequate water and coal supplies on vast stretches of track that hadn't seen a steam engine for many years was a major planning task for the organisers. But for the Western Endeavour, nothing had been left to chance. The idea of taking 3801 across the continent originated with the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum. The project was eventually backed by the state railways of New South Wales, South Australia, Western Australia, and the Commonwealth Railways. On the run across the plains, the 38s worked in relays on the train because the civil engineers had not planned on the line supporting two heavy 38s. Broken Hill was an overnight stop and an opportunity for the locomotives to be given a thorough inspection. But as at other inspection points on the journey, they needed little attention. A second tank with 7,000 gallons of water was attached. Early next day, the train, manned by South Australian Railways crews and accompanied by enthusiasts in cars, set out on the new standard gauge line to Port Pirie. Alongside was the abandoned narrow gauge line. The train was on one of the two standard gauge links that were built in the 1960s to provide Australia with its one gauge railway line connecting Brisbane to Perth. Peterborough was once a major narrow-gauge steam locomotive depot and important rail junction. When the Western Endeavour passed through, the demise of steam was evident. Stored on side tracks, cold and silent, were the 400 class Garretts, some of the 28 steam engines waiting the scrapper's torch. At Port Pirie, an air-conditioned dining car was added to the train, and crewmen from the Commonwealth Railways took over. The passengers appreciated the improved dining facilities, but up on the footplate, firemen used to diesels were wielding the shovel for the first time in their careers. At selected locations, special photographic run-bys were staged. 3813 stayed at Port Augusta, while 3801 steamed west. A 3,000 horsepower diesel CL3 was attached to save water on the long desert run. In any case, the Commonwealth Railways could not find enough qualified steam drivers for two 38s. Ahead, more than 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, across barren country almost devoid of people. A land of salt lakes, salt bush and desert. Not another town for hundreds of miles. The diesel was sent well ahead for the now memorable photo run-bys. The train carried a van full of bagged coal, a van of spare parts, and a workshop. A fitter or mechanic travelled all the way to put things back together if repairs were necessary. A dusty railway settlement, and a short stop to cross an eastbound freight. After passing the halfway point of the journey, 3801 pulled into Tarcoola. It was not much more than a whistle stop with a pub, but years ago, in the days of steam, it was a locomotive servicing depot. The return of steam was a big event. Every servicing detail enthralled spectators, and all of the children received a souvenir lump of coal. Nullarbor sunrise. During the night, the train had entered the featureless expanse of the limestone plain. Eons ago, the bed of the sea. Rusted relics of the steam age. Cook, in the days of steam, was the main engine servicing depot on the transcontinental line. For this trip, top-grade fuel had been railed well in advance across the country from the coalfields north of Sydney. Cook is home to the men who run the trains and maintain the line, and home to their families. It's just a speck on the massive emptiness of the treeless Nullarbor Plain. While the train was at Cook, the last of the motoring steam enthusiasts turned up. They'd become bogged in sand the previous evening, but unbelievably found a bulldozer in the middle of nowhere with the key in the ignition. They used it to haul their car clear of the sand. The journey continued on the longest section of straight track in the world, 297 miles, that's 478 kilometers without a bend. All day, early morning to early evening, without a curve. The border with Western Australia, a landmark, and an event worth recording. The first time a New South Wales locomotive had crossed this border. In this country, there's not too much in line-side features. With the desert behind it, the Western Endeavour had an overnight stop at Rawlinna. In the morning, washed and serviced, 3801 headed towards Kalgoorlie. An early morning crossing the luxurious eastbound Indian Pacific. At Parkston, outside Kalgoorlie, the Commonwealth Railway's diesel was detached, so 3801 could take the train solo to the end of its journey. At the gold mining city of Kalgoorlie, which has one of the longest station platforms in Australia, the Big 38 got a big welcome. While the locals enjoyed the train, many passengers toured the district. Next day, before the final run into Perth, the crew and passengers gave 3801 a good clean and polish at Merredin. Then it was an exhilarating run through glorious countryside and the Avon Valley. For the 139 passengers, it was a satisfying experience. The Western Endeavour was near its goal, the west coast of Australia. Through the suburbs of Perth, 7 days after leaving Sydney, 3801 was steaming into history in grand style. At Perth Terminal, thousands of people welcomed the train, its crew and passengers. It was a triumphant arrival, a triumph for steam. There were bands and speeches to welcome 3801 to Perth. But for those who had so many years earlier dreamed of making such a trip, there was a more eloquent, more satisfying sound. The sound of 3801, alive and at rest, after crossing the continent.
You expect it. Well, that's what it should do. You feel it's competent to do it. It's right. It did 12,000 miles a month without any trouble at all. And it's only 5,000 there and back.
The Queen of all